Hey y'all, so I'm going to give you a run through for how you're going to create a PowerPoint file that you can then use for your presentation. So everyone in your group is going to use the same PowerPoint file, so you're all going to work on this together. You can start working on this now while you're waiting for your data to come in. Your data is going to be, your PowerPoint slides are going to be set up very similar to how we would have normally done the poster presentation, but this is going to be a little bit easier for presentation purposes. Now, I've posted a few links in Canvas that show you how to do a narration or audio recording. Right now, actually, the way that I'm doing it is I'm using QuickTime to make a recording and just do a screen capture, but there actually is a built-in method both in Google Slides and in PowerPoint to add your own narration and do a show presentation. Then once you've converted that to a video file, you're going to upload those to YouTube, and then each person in your group is going to do their entire presentation right on a YouTube video. So you're going to all work from one PowerPoint file, but everyone is going to do a separate presentation. Your presentation is probably going to be 10 to 15 minutes long in total, including all these slides that you're going to see here in this file. But as you see, what you'll see here is, of course, a list of what's on the slides itself. Here's your title slide, so it's going to be your very first slide. This should include, and in the notes section here at the bottom, you're also going to see the kinds of things that are important. So you're going to have a title that tells me something about your findings, most importantly, or your hypothesis if your findings were not exactly like you expected, were not very clear. You should include all of your group members' names. Your name, the person doing the presentation, should go first in the presentation, in their name, and then everyone else should be in alphabetical order, okay? So that way, and of course, as you're talking, you're going to introduce yourself. So you're going to tell me who you are because I won't necessarily have your face on there. So it'll make it easier for me just to keep track of everybody. I would say you're going to spend about 1 to 2 minutes introducing your topic, telling me about your group members, and really sort of the rationale. Why did you get interested in this topic? What sort of got you here, okay? Then you're going to go into the introductory slide or slides. This is probably going to be a couple of slides long. This is where you're going to give me 2 to 3 studies about previous research, things that sort of got you interested in this topic. You're going to give me a little bit of background. These slides are going to tell me something about what were the findings of these studies, how these studies or their hypothesis related to your work, and any problems in these studies as they sort of relate to your research, or so things in your study that you did better than some of these other studies. You should include in-text citations, like you can see the PACS 2003 in APA style. I would guess that you're going to spend about 3 to 5 minutes on this introduction slide. Okay, so 1 to 2 minutes for the title slide, 3 to 5 minutes for these introductory slides, and again, there may be a couple of those slides because you're going to be talking about a couple of studies. Your hypothesis, this should include your research question and your hypothesis. Again, it's probably 1 to 2 minutes for this slide, so there should be 2 parts, right? If you have multiple hypotheses, I would explain these out. And again, it is often typical for researchers to have suggested a hypothesis that they actually ended up not finding in their results. They do not necessarily always talk about that. What they will often do is then change their hypothesis as if they had always thought this in the first place, because maybe they missed some literature that was really important. And so, yeah, actually, maybe because we've only had a few weeks to look up studies, maybe you missed a couple of studies that actually are really important and suggest exactly what you ended up finding. So let's say if you're interested in the effects of isolation on mood, and you predicted that isolation is going to make people's mood worse, but in fact you actually found that isolation in your study made people's mood better. There are actually studies out there that suggest mechanisms for that, right? That maybe it's because you had family support, maybe you had things to do, maybe you had other things to help you develop coping skills. So if your results are the opposite of what you originally predicted, in most cases, it is appropriate for you to change your hypothesis to match what you actually found. Okay, that is a very typical procedure. So your hypothesis, again, is about 1 to 2 minutes. Then you're going to talk about your participants. This is likely going to be a couple of slides because you're going to tell me your total number of participants. You're going to talk about your sampling procedure, and you're going to talk about all of your demographics, your age, your gender, your race and ethnicity, other kinds of things. You might include tables or graphs, and you'll see in the example poster presentations that I've linked on a page. That in fact there's multiple ways in which you can present this information. Google Forms actually creates for you some breakdown pie charts for demographics. You can use those as long as the information is legible. So as long as the text is legible, that's okay. If it starts to get pixelated, that means you need to actually make new graphs or tables to make your data more visible, okay? Next, after your participants, what you're going to go into is your methods, which really is your procedure. So this might be where you use pictures to demonstrate your method. In this case, right, if you were showing people images or videos, you should show those videos. You might show those images for people to have an idea. Again, it's just to give them a sample, so you don't have to watch the entire video, but give them a sense about what participants were experiencing. You should tell me your independent variables. So if you did an experiment, you should tell me the methods you used to try to reduce problems with internal validity or threats to internal validity. You should tell me what your dependent variables were. If you didn't talk about sampling procedure on the previous slide, it should be here. You should talk about the kinds of analysis you did. So here I talk about correlational analysis and the different measures we used. If you used other people's surveys, you should cite those surveys. You should give in-text citations here in the method section. And you should talk about the APA Code of Ethics, right? That they were debriefed and their data was confidential, things like that, okay? So these 2, 3, 4 slides are going to be your method. So we're talking 1 to 2 minutes for the title slide, 3 to 5 minutes for the introductory slide or slides, 1 to 2 minutes for your hypothesis. I would say you're probably talking about 2 to 4 minutes for your method. Then you're going to get into your results. My guess is you're not going to have enough time to talk about all of your results. You're going to pick the most important 2 or 3 results that you found, okay? Things that go along with your major hypotheses. Again, you've only got 10 to 15 minutes for this entire presentation, so I want to make sure that you are definitely done by 15 minutes. So I want you to time it. If it may end up that you have more results that you can end up talking about in your presentation, that's okay. That means you're going to then use these in your final paper, okay? So anything you don't have a chance to talk about in your presentation will end up in your final paper. You can see here, I mentioned in this method slide we were going to do correlational analysis. That's what a lot of you are doing. I'll remind you that a correlation runs the comparison between 2 variables. So this is the correlation between these PSS-10 stress scores, and I've talked to some of you about this. It's the perceived stress scale. And then this is the correlation between their symptoms of cold and flu, their allergy, and their headaches. So one of the things you can see is that we didn't really have any correlation, right? Remember, correlations run from 0 to 1.0. There's no correlation with cold and flu symptoms in PSS-10. There's a small correlation between allergy symptoms and PSS-10. There is actually a moderately weak correlation between headaches and PSS-10. So that might be something you had predicted, and so you might then talk about those relationships. You could use scatter plots. You can use bar graphs. You can use tables like this to show correlation coefficients. It just depends on what is the major thing you're interested in. Again, I want you to remember that you're going to be trying to remind the audience of your hypothesis, right, that relates to what the data is. And then you're going to tell a very quick statement, right? Stress is not really related to illness. So of these symptoms, we saw, yeah, some small correlations, but not really strong, okay? That contrasts with the next slide, where greater stress was associated with an unhappy mood, right? So negative mood was positively correlated with the PSS-10 score. So that means that the higher your PSS-10, the higher your stress, the higher your level of negative mood, okay? So that supports your hypothesis. Again, you want to remind your audience of your different hypotheses and how these findings make sense to what you're studying. And then lastly, we've got one more, that greater stress was associated with poor sleep quality. So the amount of sleep, again, the correlation was only 0.04 with PSS-10, so that's not a significant correlation, but poor sleep quality was significantly correlated with a correlation of 0.59, which is pretty strong. Right, that would suggest that there's a moderate correlation between poor sleep quality and PSS-10. So worse sleep quality, more stress, okay? Again, these are just ones from a study that I did many, many years ago, but kind of giving you some ideas about some of the things we might expect to find. Then in your discussion, you're really going to summarize your findings really briefly, right? Perceived stress was associated with negative mood and poor sleep quality in a very ethnically, racially, and diverse sample. There was no link between stress and physical illness. This is actually very similar to research that we've seen in both children and adults, for example. And then you're going to go into some of these other studies. So you're going to give me about 2 to 3 studies that have shown things related to your study. If you found something different than other studies, you also can highlight those. Actually, we found something very different than what other studies have found. Maybe that's because of the current conditions that are going on, right? There are so many things you might be able to talk about here. This is where you really get to use your inference and your ability to sort of draw on and connect together previous research to your study. And again, remember, we are in very unusual times currently, which means some of the findings you have may be a product of just the current situation that's happening. It could also be, this is actually one of the first semesters where we've had almost 18 online-only studies. So it may also be that there are differences in students who are taking these online studies. Maybe, for example, if your study was one of the last ones posted, that students have fatigue and they're not really participating much, or maybe when they participate, they're not answering very accurately, or, right, I mean, there's a number of things that might be happening. But I'll let you sort of think about some of those issues, and then you'll bring them up in the problems, right? So it could be that people's memory of what's their sleep quality or their PSS-10 is actually inaccurate, that they're actually biased in remembering. People's memory is pretty poor in general. You might talk about this is a correlational study, right? So we can't really conclude that there's a causal relationship. So you might talk about the 4 major kinds of validity discussed in class: problems with internal validity, external validity, construct validity, or statistical validity. I expect to see some of those considered. If you're doing a correlational study, of course, right, we cannot conclude about causation, which means your internal validity is shot. You don't have any. But you still have potentially external validity, and you still have hopefully good construct or statistical validity. So let's talk about that. The other things I haven't talked about, but I'll talk about when we do data analysis, is how you're going to talk about p-values. P-values tell us whether or not we can conclude that there is a statistically significant relationship, as you may remember from statistics. So we'll do another video series to talk about how you're going to put those up, okay? Lastly, you're going to have references. You should have a total of 4 to 6 references. These should include, one's included in your introduction, so any previous studies, those 2 to 3 studies you talked about in your intro, I should see cited here. Any methods you used from other people. So if you use 2 other surveys from other people, I should see those in your methods, and I should see those here. And then the 2 or 3 studies you're going to talk about in your discussion. Now, the discussion studies might actually be some of the very similar ones that you talked about in your intro. So there can be some overlap there. But again, you want a minimum of 4. And you want it maybe up to 6. It could even be more if what you use in your intro is very different than what you ended up using in your discussion. You might actually have 7 or potentially 8 studies, but 4 to 6 should be what you're aiming for. Please note, 4 gets you a C on this portion of the assignment, 5 gets you a B on this portion of the assignment, and the 6 gets you an A on this portion of the assignment. So I like to tie numbers to grades. It makes it easier to think about, okay? Hopefully that answers some of your questions about your presentation. Please send me an email if you have any questions.